In this screencast, we're going to look at the fundamentals of activity-based costing. One of the primary uses of ABC is to allocate overhead costs to work in process inventory. The justification for using activity-based costing is to improve the accuracy in the assignment of overhead costs. The main insight is that not all jobs or processes will use the same mix of overhead costs, and by using activity-based costing, we can vary the assignment of overhead costs in such a way as to generate a more accurate costing number. The key to activity-based costing is the appropriate selection of cost drivers. The better the cost drivers match the use of variable and fixed resources, the more accurate the final activity-based costing calculation will be. In a traditional costing system, overhead is accumulated in the overhead control account and then allocated to jobs. In this example, we're going to allocate the overhead on the basis of direct labor costs. We can see that job 101 uses $30,000 of direct labor, and job 102 uses $20,000. Therefore, the percentage of direct labor used by job 101 is 30,000 all over 20,000 plus 30,000, and that's equal to 60%. Therefore, 60% of the overhead would be allocated to job 101. Well, the total overhead was $100,000, and 60% of that is $60,000, and that goes to job 101, and the remainder, $40,000, goes to job 102. Now, what we're really concerned about is that the overhead uses resources such as indirect labor, depreciation, utilities, miscellaneous charges. And we can see that the overhead in this example consists of 25% indirect labor, 50% depreciation, 18% utilities, and 7% miscellaneous. When $60,000 is allocated to job 101, we are going to see exactly the same mix of overhead resources being assigned to job 101. In other words, 25% indirect labor, so 25% times 60,000 results in $15,000 of indirect labor ending up in job 101. And we could do that same type of calculation for depreciation, utilities, and miscellaneous. Of course, what's important here is that job 102, even though it only gets $40,000 of total overhead, will still have the same mix of resources assigned to it. And the question is that mix appropriate for both jobs 101 and 102? Now we're going to turn to an example where we're going to use activity-based costing. Once again, we'll start off with an overhead control account in which we have indirect labor, depreciation, utilities, and miscellaneous charges, but this time you can see the mix will be slightly different. What we're going to do is apply activity-based costing to see how we could vary the mix assigned to a given job from the mix that is inherent in the overhead control account. The first step is to take the overhead costs and to assign them to activities. In this case, we've identified the activities as setups, inspections, and miscellaneous charges. A study was commissioned to determine how much of each particular type of overhead costs should be assigned to each of the activities. So, for example, it was determined that 50% of indirect labor should go to setups, 45% to inspections, and 5% to miscellaneous charges. If we look at the bottom panel, then we can see that the actual costs are now allocated. So $120,000, 50% goes to setups, means that the setup account will receive $60,000. And we can use that process to fill out the total amount of costs to be allocated to setups, inspections, and miscellaneous charges. So setups, inspections, and miscellaneous charges are the activity cost pools that we will use to allocate overhead. As you can see, the original mix of overhead costs are represented by 49.4% indirect labor, 41.2% depreciation, etc. If we look at the setup costs, we see that the mix of overhead costs are quite different. 70.6% of all setup costs are indirect labor, and this was calculated by taking the $60,000 and dividing by the total cost allocated to setups, $84,950. And that's equal to approximately 70.6%. And we can also look at inspections and see that it has a different mix for the use of overhead resources as well. Having determined how much overhead should be assigned to each of the activities, so that would be $84,950 to set up, $135,450 to inspection, and $22,600 to miscellaneous charges, we now need to figure out how to assign those costs to jobs. And we do that the same way we would do it for any overhead activity. If we're using an actual overhead system, we would take the costs and divide by the actual amount of cost of the cost driver. And if we're using a predetermined overhead rate system, we would take the amount and divide that by the amount of the expected activity. So for example, in the case of inspections, we take the $135,450 and divide by the expected number of inspections, and that equals approximately $63.73 per inspection. What this means then is that every time a job uses an inspection, $67.73 of costs are moved from the inspection activity to the work in process account for that job. Now let's consider the overhead costs assigned to a job that uses 1 setup, 40 inspections, and 200 labor hours. Well, the total amount of overhead costs assigned to that job will be $849.50 times 1 plus $67.73 times 40 plus $452 times 200, where 200 represents the labor hours, which are the cost driver for miscellaneous charges. In the end, we end up with $4,462.50 of overhead assigned to that job. This is a fairly complicated slide, but what we want to do is trace the overhead costs from the original overhead account through the activities and then to the assignment of overhead to the job we used in the example. So we start off with the original overhead and note the original mix of overhead resources. Those costs were then allocated to setups, inspections, and miscellaneous, our activities. Each activity has its own mix for the use of overhead resources. Next, we calculated an activity rate, and then we applied that activity rate to the particular job that we were interested in. we ended up with $850 of setup costs, $2,709 of inspection costs, and $904 of miscellaneous costs. If we look at the inspection costs, we see that the $2,709 breaks down into $1,080 of indirect labor, $1,400 of depreciation, $165 of utilities, and $64 of miscellaneous costs. The way we would get that is we would take the $2,709 and say multiply it by the 39.9% of indirect labor that we can see from up here, and that's how we get the $1,080 of indirect labor assigned to the job through the use of inspections. Now, to see how much, say, utilities are charged to the job, we could take the $38, the $165, and the $128 that are assigned through each of the activities, sum it up to $323. Now, what percentage of that is that of the total overhead? Well, 323 divided by 4463, and that's equal to 7.2%. So now we're in a position to compare the resource mix for this job with the resource mix of the original overhead account, and we can see they're quite similar. However, indirect labor is slightly less for this job than in the original overhead mix, while depreciation is slightly more. What's important to notice, however, is that the final mix of overhead resources is allowed to vary from the original mix of overhead resources depending upon the use of activities by the individual job. So a recap of the process is we start off with overhead costs by type. We identify activities and cost drivers, and we use that to assign the overhead costs to the activity cost pools. We then determine activity rates and use those activity rates to assign costs from the activity cost pools to the work in process inventory. So instead of going directly from overhead to work in process as we would go in a traditional system, we use this less direct method in the hope of getting a more accurate reflection of resource usage assigned to individual jobs.